Chapter 30, The Hollow Crown. The air in the catacombs lay heavy and unmoving, thick with the mineral tang of saltpeter and the quieter, more insidious residue of old burials, as though the earth itself resisted disturbance and remembered every intrusion. Elund had led her tiny band through that suffocating dark while above them, the dull thunder of Seniad's engines striking stone. Below, the world narrowed. Mordred waited where the tunnel closed in, his presence inevitable, as though the path had always been intended to lead to him. There was nothing of the boy that Elund remembered left in his stance, and he looked far away, as if part of his mind was operating on another level. "You speak of protection, Matthew," Elund said, her voice low, functional, and held on to her blade. "But if Seniad's men are already in these tunnels, which I suspect they are, they will not take the throne, but the vulnerable, the old, the infirm. Is that the shape of your new world?" "It is the cost of ending a lie," he replied, his tone steady, his eyes golden as she had seen with Morgana earlier that day. Her old friend fixed her with a look so intense that it took all her will not to look away. "Step aside, Elund. I cannot protect you otherwise." But Elund took a step forward, closing the distance between them until the tip of her blade rested lightly against his chest. "Ah, Emrys." Mordred's voice was not fearful of Lancelot's weapon, but filled instead with understanding. "You are here." "Of course you are." Merlin said nothing, not least because Kay and several other of the guards were with them. For a moment neither moved, and that standoff might have continued if the sound of iron-nailed boots could not be heard. The Saxons were advancing. 88,888,888. Elund turned without hesitation, her voice cutting through the confined space, issuing orders to those men who had followed her. "Hold the line," she instructed. "If they pass us, then it is over. Don't stop until they hit the heart of the citadel." The clash that followed bore little resemblance to combat of the training grounds, and the Camelot group soon adapted to close-quarter attack. Elund fought within that chaos with a kind of brutal economy. When a housecarl raised a mace high enough to crush through helmet and bone alike, she attacked man, not weapon, driving into him with the full force of her momentum. Elund breastfed, and recognized for a moment a man she knew. It was Aldred, who she had last seen in Gwilod, as she fought the wyvern. But there was no time to think, only act, as the four of them slowly reclaimed the tunnel. From the shadowed edge of the tunnel, Mordred watched Elund fight on her terms. She was in Camelot because she chose to be. She wasn't compelled. This was not her throne, and her spirit inspired the men around her to match her. Then, Mordred made his move. With a gesture so slight it might have gone unnoticed in the darkness, the warlock's play might have been mistaken for distortion of the air from the torch fire. Behind him, Emrys watched Mordred, Arthur's bane, alter the space itself. Stone above the advancing Saxon reinforcements groaned before giving way in a violent collapse that sealed the passage behind the first wave, crushing those still advancing into an indistinct mass of shattered rock and broken bodies. "A broken bar for her, warlock in denial." A broken bar. The words came directly to Merlin's mind. When he jerked his head to Mordred, the young man simply looked back at him with a blank expression. "Go." Whoever said it, and later Elund swore it was Merlin, although Kay and Elphice were convinced it was her, all were united in its volume and ferocity. Around them, more ancient Roman brickwork quaked. They fled. The enemy could no more come along the passage as they could drive towards the enemy. One passageway into Camelot was secure. More needed to follow. 88,888,888. As she left, Matthew spoke to Elund in the way he had done when they were children. "Remember my choice, Aeled. Remember." 88,888,888. Violence had resumed again. Now night was well advanced. But there was no time to process anything strategic. Instead, Elund gathered what remained of the fighters and drove them upward, up the steps and into the violence above. Where the south gate had once stood, smoke coiled up into the flame-lit sky. Below them, the courtyard was a mass of shifting bodies. Steel clashing steel as Camelot knights and guards fought invaders, surrounded by fire, and shouted commands mixing Saxon with Cymric in a loud maelstrom. And at the center, Atha, surrounded by knights, and one Saxon, King Senyard of White Goat. Behind them, on the roof of the stables, stood Morgause, her presence unmistakable, her arms raised, a creeping, unnatural cold spilling outward in a pale mist that blurred vision and dulled aim. What Elune did next defied logic and, to any onlooker, seemed as if she were a traitor. "Take the guards to the rear," she ordered. It was enough, and Elune surged forward, pushing herself within the Saxon melee, shouting in Saxon as if she was one of Senyard's, her accent indistinguishable from their own. "Move left. Drive the bastard Cymric to their own walls. Split the party." Arthur saw the change in strategy, and knew something was working in his favor. He stood straighter, energy and confidence renewed. He met Senyard's next strike with intent, redirecting it and answering in kind, the force of the exchange sending the Eastern King backwards, breaking the line just enough for the knights with him to take advantage, meeting warrior one-on-one. Arthur turned. Elune's blade met his, and she turned to fight beside him. 88,888,888. Above them, Morgause saw the change in the men, saw the advantage fall to Camelot's side and Senyard's beginnings of a retreat, controlled and deliberate in their fall back, dissolving towards the gates of the castle and then back to the tree line from which they had emerged. Additionally, and more crucially, she knew Mordred had withdrawn from the Roman sewer. The fight was over, and the Saxons had not gained Camelot. And so, Morgause fled, but not without leaving a message for her sister in the mind of the Lady Morgana. 88,888,888. As the light of the next day came, the scene was one of utter devastation. No army had ever breached Camelot's walls before, but that they had and they had been repelled was heartening, and showed that the system of knights and guards benefited Camelot. How much effect had there been in declaring fealty to Arthur was, however, debatable. However, every knight she had met that day had given his all. One way or another, they had succeeding in driving the Saxon from the castle, but not from the land. Elune, sitting on the steps from utter exhaustion, not even with enough effort to begin to clean her blade, knew, as everyone else knew, the Saxons would go back to their camp and try again. She tried again to clean Lancelot's sword, but her hands shook too much to try again without doing herself an injury. Beside her, Arthur approached, then sat beside her, a little too close, perhaps, but Elune was too tired to protest. He reached for the cloth without comment and took the Cymric sword, finishing the job for her. Before glancing at her face, he raised his hand and wiped a streak of dried blood from her cheek. Elune was even too tired to express a dry, barbed retort. Mordred was there, she managed. He intervened, closed the tunnel on the Saxons. Arthur's expression tightened, not in surprise, but in confirmation of a threat he had already begun to comprehend. He intervened, she continued, but not for Camelot. Arthur said nothing for a moment. Instead, he shifted closer, his arm coming around her shoulders, not formally, not as prince to subject, but as something far less defined and far more dangerous in its lack of clarity. Elune flinched at the invasion of personal space. "You held the line," he said. "You turned the breach. You were a mercenary again. I saw you, with Senyard. I thought a broken bar." But Elune had let her head rest, briefly, against his shoulder, out of exhaustion. From across the courtyard, Gawain saw her, and narrowed his eyes. Then, he saw Arthur say something to her, but Elune had slumped forward, unconscious, beyond his lap and onto the stone before him. Gawain was before her before even Arthur could move. "Take her to Gaius," Merlin called from behind Gawain, for he too had seen her fall. And he noticed the blood, and the paleness of her face, and helped the knight take Elune the Saxon to the physician of Camelot, hoping that it would not be too late for her.